Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's New in Historical Fiction, a regular panel series that includes historical novelists with new and upcoming titles. My name is Colin Mustful. I am the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, and we're an independent publisher of historical fiction. I'm really glad you could join us today, and I'm really excited about this wonderful panel. Just a couple housekeeping things before we get going. So we do have a chat where you can interact with our panelists there. Your mics and cameras will remain muted, but please go ahead and say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're joining us from, maybe what you're reading right now. And then later during the panel, I'm going to invite questions from the audience with about 15 minutes left in the event. I do have a link to all of our authors' books, which I'm going to post in the chat, and that will show you each of our panelists' books with a link to bookshop.org, because bookshop.org gives a percentage of sales back to independent bookstores. So we always appreciate when you buy from bookshop.org instead of some of the other retailers. I would just want to thank everyone for registering for this event. It is a free event, and I always want to keep it free, but we do accept contributions, and some people did contribute. Thank you so much for that. It helps pay for the event platform and the Zoom platform, so we definitely very much appreciate that. Okay, without further ado, let's introduce each one of our panelists. I'm going to remove myself from the screen. Okay, let's start with Shawntelle Madison, author of The Fallen Fruit. Shawntelle, if you could say hello and just tell us a little bit about your novel.
Oh, hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, good afternoon to everyone. I'm so excited to be here with everyone and these wonderful panelists. A little bit about myself. I started out writing urban fantasy, but I've progressed into other areas of speculative fiction as well as romance. And as far as The Fallen Fruit, this is my debut historical fiction. So I'm really excited about that. The Fallen Fruit is about a Black family of time travelers, and it's a family of saga spanning from the American Revolution all the way up to the Civil Rights era. And it revolves around a woman discovering her family's history and trying to figure out how she can stop the family curse of time travel. So it's kind of expanding a really big universe into a tiny bottle, but that's pretty much the gist of it.
Thank you, Shawntelle. Next, let's say hello to Brynn Barineau, author of Jaguars and Other Game. Brynn's novel isn't necessarily brand new, but we tried to have Brynn on earlier when her book first came out, and we had some technical difficulties, so we've invited her back. Hi, Brynn.
Hi, Colin. Thank you so much for having me back now that I don't have a vintage computer. So, yes, my name is Brynn. I am originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and my background is in international communication. And I worked in higher education in the Office of International Education at American University before I met my husband, who happened to be from Brazil. And so I moved to Brazil and I lived there for 14 years and I taught in a high school. I taught Brazilian students in high school in Brazil. And I started writing creative nonfiction as a way to process culture shock and adaptation. And I use a lot of humor and as a way of processing. And so what creative nonfiction essays eventually developed into fiction because I was not seeing many stories published in English in the United States set in Brazil. It was easier to find stories set on a space station than in Brazil. And Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world in terms of population. And so I thought I was like, well, maybe I can be this unique cultural bridge and write stories in English, set them in Brazil based on my knowledge and my experience with my own multicultural family. And I am now back in Atlanta, have been since 2020, and introducing my daughter and my husband to like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and Atlanta. And Jaguars and Other Game is my debut novel. And oh, quickly, what it is a gender flipped Three Musketeers set in 1809 Rio de Janeiro. So if you love Pirates of the
Ooh.
Caribbean, if you loved The Three Musketeers, but we're sad that it's actually a little sexist, I fixed it and it's now in Rio, and it's a team, it's all about sisterhood and found family and the power when we choose to be curious and supportive and work together, particularly amongst women.
Awesome. Thank you, Brynn. Next, we have Kaia Anderson, author of In a League of Her Own. Kaia, hello.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for having me. And my book, In a League of Her Own, is autobiographical historical fiction. And it is about a woman in 1930s Harlem her main goal is to social climb within that society and make a name for herself and create her own little business. And then when she marries this man with a lot of money, he kind of upends that plan by buying a Negro Leagues team and making her the general manager. And it's actually based on the real life of Effa Manley, who is my protagonist. And she's a very fascinating person without me having to embellish her story. She is currently the only woman who has been inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. And she was this character who she didn't never had her own place because she presented everybody. If you looked at her, you would think she was a white woman, but she actually has a multicultural background. She grew up in a Black household, and she was born in 1897. So we're talking about socially that it was a little bit different than it was today, just where everybody thinks you're one part of one racial group and you think you're a part of another. And she's navigating it within this society of Harlem and doing her social justice work, and then joining into the men's club that is Negro Leagues baseball and later on Major League Baseball.
Thank you, Kaia.
You're welcome.
Shawntell's playing some hide and seek with us. Donna, welcome. Donna Jones Alward is the author of When the World Fell Silent. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited. This is my debut historical fiction, but not my debut novel. So I've been writing for a really long time. I wrote romance for, I'm going to say, close to 20 years now. And so I was getting close to a milestone birthday and feeling like I wanted a challenge, something different. I've always been a huge fan of the genre. And an opportunity came my way, and it was one of those things where I knew I'd always regret it if I didn't at least try, because historical fiction had intimidated me for a really long time. The research, being afraid of getting it wrong, it's a much bigger scope than what I was used to writing. And so I did. I thought if I failed, then oh well, I would do something else. And it's turned out okay. So it's the story of two women who have to navigate the aftermath of the Halifax explosion, which happened in 1917 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is where I live. It was the biggest man-made explosion in history until the detonation of the atom bomb. And most people don't even know that it happened. So I use that as my backdrop. We have two women from very different backgrounds who have to figure out how they're going to move forward, and the choices that they make have consequences. So there's a secret that that is keeping that actually puts them on a path towards each other. And then when the secret comes out, like, no one's going to be the same after. So that's the gist of what it's about.
Well, thanks, Donna. Congratulations on your foray into historical fiction. Let's stick with you because you mentioned that the night nobody knows about this explosion. I knew nothing about it until I invited you on this panel. So tell us a little bit more about what it is and why you think it's not very well known.
Sometimes I wonder if it's not well known because it's a home front story. So, it happened not in the European theater, but here at home. Sometimes I wonder if it's because it's Canadian, but the truth is, as a Canadian, I didn't learn about it in school either. And I have no explanation as to why. I learned about it through fiction in grade 12 when I read Barometer Rising, which is a book by Hugh MacLennan. And so when I was looking at developing a story, I knew this was a time period and a setting I wanted to use. What happened was, at the time, Halifax was a huge port for Eastern Seaboard ships to go to Europe. And it didn't freeze in the winter. It was deep water port. So ships would gather here, they would form convoys and head overseas. So on December 6th of 1917, a munitions ship came into the harbor that morning. There was a relief ship leaving. They had a bit of a disagreement over who had the right of way, and they collided. Because of what the munitions ship was carrying, caught on fire, and then it exploded. And no one other than a handful of people knew what was on board, because it was very important to keep things secret. And so the explosion was devastating. It killed almost 2,000, wounded 9,000 more, left about 25,000 without adequate housing. And Halifax is not a huge city. So it was devastating. And I just thought that it would be really great to bring this kind of story to a bigger audience.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's go to Shawntelle. Shawntelle, I'm very curious to know more about your genre, which is a little bit into, I don't know if you'd call it fantasy. And so tell us a little bit more about how you combine these elements of fiction, history, and fantasy.
So I've been doing speculative since the beginning. I was one of those kids who was in the library in the sci-fi section reading Heinlein, Asimov, and during that time I discovered Octavia Butler, which of course gave me the time travel bug after reading Kindred. And so kind of that otherness of writing speculative kind of leaked into as I dove into historical fiction. And so another part of my background is I do my family's genealogy. Like I go in deep, and in exploring my family's genealogy, I kind of had that moment of after discovering my sixth generation great grandmother and her life in Charlottesville, Virginia, where she had bought hundreds of acres of land surrounded by plantations like the Carrs and a lot of the other folks. You have Monticello, other places nearby. And I was like, how did she survive? What was her life like in post-American Revolution? And that kind of gave me the idea for what would it be like if her family were time travelers. And so that was that next step of specifically when you were living in this space and having to deal with all of these things, how would that family, survive? What mechanisms would they come up with over time, over the decades, over the years, still with slavery and the Civil War, going into Jim Crow? How would this family actually protect their children as they fell through time? So it kind of came about through several factors: genealogy, the what if question, and my family's history. So that kind of thing.
Thank you so much, Shawntelle. I'm a little bit worried that some people aren't being able to get in from the waiting room. So I just downloaded a list of participants. I'm going to email them a direct link via Zoom, the Zoom link. But anyways, we'll continue on as best we can. Let's go to Kaia. Kaia, your book is about a real historical figure, Effa Manley. Tell us about how you discovered her story and how long it took you to be inspired to write a book about her.
Well, after I finished my first book, Sisters in Arms, I knew I wanted to stay within the early 20th century time period. And I knew 4 women had played in the Negro League. So I was like, okay, I'm going to do a baseball book. I was a huge baseball fan in middle school. So I was like, this is right up my alley. And as I'm doing my preliminary research online, I find this article about the 4 women who owned Negro League teams. And I'm like, what? And then as I start reading about these women, Effa Manley's story jumped out to me the most. She's actually the most written about of the 4 and the most well-known. And I resonated with her story because, again, she was a woman who appeared to be a white woman but identified as Black. And one of my grandmothers was very fair skinned, and she passed when I was young. Before growing up, I could, when I was older, to ask the questions, what was it like living in the 20s and 30s and 40s, looking the way you looked? And when I was very young, I asked her, Grandma, are you white? And she very specifically said, no, I am not. And when you look at literature about passing and fair-skinned women, it's always like, if you could do it, you would do it, passing. And have my grandmother say, no, that wasn't even, I never even considered it. And to find Effa Manley having that similar experience, it was my way of kind of exploring those questions, asking the questions I couldn't ask my grandmother. But just getting into the head of my fictional Effa was very difficult. It took me a while to get there. I found somebody's master's thesis about the psychology of Effa Manley and what it was like to grow up in a Black family, being told at 15, 16 years old, no, you're actually white, in 1917 in Philadelphia, things like that. And even then, I still had to play with, why did you make the decisions that you made throughout this time period, or how to even narrow her story, because basically from conception to death, her life was a soap opera. Thankfully, she kept a scrapbook from 1932 to 1947, which was basically her baseball years. So I was able to go to Cooperstown, look through that scrapbook, and it helped me narrow down her story to the years that was documented. And just to see her scrapbook with from the handwriting, I could tell it was later in life. She would write little notes, this isn't true, this is what really happened. And I dedicate the book to her, and I say flowers, because throughout her scrapbook in an article she'll put flowers, 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 where she was getting praise, and where you could see where in her lifetime she was actively downplaying herself and propping up the men around her, and you could tell she really wanted that recognition. So this is my way of helping her to get that recognition posthumously.
How long did it take you to go through all that archive of materials?
I was
Wow.
there 3 days. Basically the first day I took pictures of everything in case I needed to go back to it. The second day I really just went through every page by page, looked at it, examined it, and then I went back a third day. I almost didn't go, and I basically just took the book and said, okay, Effa, what is it you want me to know? What did I overlook? And just opened the book, and it opened to this article that I had overlooked and was actually made it into a scene in the book.
Nice.
And Kaia, I have to ask, are you also a baseball fan, or?
Yes. My middle school years, I was a diehard Yankees fan. I knew everything. My research geekiness showed that I knew people's names, where they lived, where they grew up. I knew all the history of the Yankees. I knew Murderers Row by memory. So when my dad mentioned the Negro Leagues to me, I was offended. I was like, what's that? But then when I was working on this project, and it was like, wait, I grew up in New Jersey, to find out there was a Negro Leagues team in New Jersey in my 40s, after, being this big baseball geek growing up in New Jersey, I was offended. They own the Newark Eagles. So I was just like, oh my God, there's so much history, even within where I grew up, that Black history that just completely, I walk by every day and it had no idea while I was working on this project.
Yeah.
So really interesting.
Well, I am a Twins fan. I kind of hate the Yankees, but we can talk about that another time.
Okay. If it makes you feel better, this is not a New York Yankees hat. This is a 1935 Brooklyn Eagles hat. Their first year they were in Brooklyn, and because the Manleys, her and her husband, were frugal, I think because this is slightly imperfect over here, you can see where it's the N and the Y blend together. I think the Yankees rejected it, and Effa negotiated a really good deal. So this is their debut year hat. So no disrespect.
Wow, that's cool. Well, Brynn, I'm very curious to know about the kind of political and historical context of your novel. It's 1808, Rio de Janeiro, and you have the Portuguese royal court fleeing to Brazil. So tell us more about that.
So in 1808, Napoleon's like making his way across Europe, and he sends a letter to the Prince Regent, Prince João, at the time, and basically says, we're coming for you. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. And Prince João says, easy way, no problem. And then secretly communicates with the British and is like, please help us. And so the British ferry the entire Portuguese royal family from Lisbon, plus 10,000 of their closest friends, to Rio de Janeiro. And they land in Rio in March of 1808, and they show up and assume they own the place because they're the monarch and the royal family, and this is a colony. But Rio has, the first Portuguese showed up in Rio in 1501. So for 300 years, it has been a multiracial, multicultural colony that has developed its own Brazilian culture. And then 10,000 Portuguese show up thinking they own the place. And so this is the only time in the history of European colonialism that the seat of the colonial empire moved to a colony. And the colony became the governing center of the empire. And the Portuguese royal family stayed in Rio from 1808 to 1821. And my story is set in that first year. They're celebrating, the events going on around them are the 1-year anniversary of the Portuguese royal family arriving in Rio. Of course, not everyone is thrilled that these 10,000 people have shown up on their doorstep and expect to have the best of everything. They take up all the space, they eat all the food. So there's a lot of political tension. But at the same time, the arrival of the Portuguese royal family opened up the ports because they had been closed to any trade except with Portugal. But when the royal family arrived, the ports opened up. The British could suddenly trade. All the diplomats became visiting the Portuguese royal family, were showing up in Rio. And so commerce also exploded with them. They had their first newspaper, they had their first university in Brazil when the Portuguese royal family came. So it was just this huge upheaval. There's all this tension, there's all this like massive cultural shifts. And then my heroines, who are all fictional, my 3 protagonists are all fictional, but everything around them is real, the upheaval. And so their reactions to it reflect some excited by the change and the opportunities, some very wary, very angry at the arrogance of the Portuguese family. And one of them is a Portuguese immigrant who came with the court, Victoria, and she is just a fish out of water. She is going through culture shock through a lot of the book. So that's where it's set. So in that very tumultuous European royalty in a tropical city, and all the tension and a lot of comedy of errors that ensue from that.
Very ripe for a story then.
Very, very. It was shocking. I studied international relations in college, and we did a ton about colonialism and European colonialism. And I did not know that the Portuguese royal family moved to Brazil and created the United Kingdom of Portugal and Brazil until I moved to Rio. Like that did not come up anywhere in my undergraduate education. It was totally pretty much British and French colonialism, and Spanish. And no one ever said anything about Portugal. But it was just so this incredibly unique moment in history that I had heard nothing about. I wanted to share. I was like, people need to have the opportunity to read about this.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think all of you now have kind of expressed this notion that, well, the history wasn't being told, so we needed to write and share it with people. And I think that's wonderful. Let's go back to Donna. Donna, you talked about the 1917 Halifax explosion, but in order to tell that story, you had to create these characters, Noah Crowell and Charlotte Campbell. Now, I guess I'm not positive if they're historical figures or fictional characters, so tell me about who they are and how you use them to tell this story.
Both of these characters are completely fictional. I did not base them on any one person, but instead created 2 characters that I felt represented a lot of what women in particular went through after the explosion. So with Nora, she is a Bluebird nurse, so she's part of the military. She's a nurse at the new convalescent hospital in Halifax. And, she's more she's actually career oriented, which is a little bit different for the time as it is. And lives with her sister, who is the opposite. She's very domestic. She's married. Her husband is serving, has a couple of kids. So Nora's a little bit different. But when the explosion happens, she's no different than anyone else in that, there are losses, and she has to deal with the aftermath in a much more visceral way than most people because she's working at the hospital. The Campbell Hospital was built to serve about 300 people, just under. And within the first day or so of the explosion, they had over 1,400 casualties there. So it was completely overrun. I kind of took that tack with her. And then when I decided to build the character of Charlotte, she's very much representative of working class in Halifax. She had worked in a textile factory. Her husband was killed over a small child. Now she has to live with her in-laws. It's not really a happy existence. She doesn't have a lot of choices. But her daughter is everything to her. So when the explosion happens and her life changes, she doesn't have a lot of resources to draw upon and has to look at unique ways of trying to move forward and build a life for herself. And so I really did a lot of reading, both fiction. There are some fiction books about the explosion, not many, and a lot of nonfiction about different families who were torn apart during the explosion. People who were blinded. It was the biggest mass blinding in Canadian history. People had gone to their windows to see what was happening because Halifax is on a hill. You can look down over the harbor. And when it exploded, the glass all came in, and many people lost complete vision or at least partial vision. And it led to the development of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind in Canada, which that's a personal thing for me because my mom is legally blind and uses their resources. So there were a lot of things like that I just wanted to be, I didn't want to be limited with following one person. I wanted to be able to bring a whole lot of elements in and create my own characters that make their way through. Now, there are some walk-on roles that are real people, particularly at the hospital. But my main characters are all fictional people.
Well, I think that's a great way then to be able to cover all those different elements of the story. And I must say, I do like your book blanket.
Oh, so I don't know how easy it is to see, but I have a throw on the back of, I have a futon. There's a cat back there too, on the back of my futon, and it's all books, and the spines have titles of, I freelance edit on the side. And so one of my clients did it up, and it's the titles of all the books we've worked on together. And yeah, I know. And then, she's got her name on it, and then she's got like my name on the teacup and everything. It was the sweetest gift. She got it for me last year for Christmas. So
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Shawntelle, I have to admit that I wasn't able to focus on your previous answer, so I'm going to ask you a two-part question, just in case you already talked about the first part. I want to know more about what it was like to get to know your ancestors as you did this kind of generational history. And I also really love the cover and the titles. So if you could talk a little bit about coming up with those elements.
the cover's gorgeous, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I have to say, I'll go with the cover first. I don't know if I would heard of it. It was from, I believe, Kelly Barnhill, a book called When Women Were Dragons. I believe that was the title of the book. And it was about how in the 1950s, I believe, there was the Great Dragoning. And during that, the basically women, I think of about 100,000 women changed into dragons. I definitely recommend the book, definitely historical fiction. And there were definitely women in instances where they were vulnerable, but once they became dragons, they were not vulnerable anymore. That's all I'm gonna say. And so when I saw that cover by Kelly, it kind of has this foliage, and within the foliage, you see the hint of a dragon within the foliage. And so when I saw that, I was like, ooh, I love the sense of how the foliage kind of like sucks you in and you become lost in it. And so when I was speaking with the art team at HarperCollins, I said, I love this cover. And if there's any way you can bring out the lost in the Virginia woods, getting sucked into the orchard, falling back in time, and translating that, that's how that ended up happening. As far as the title, the original title was The Fallen Fruit from Their Orchard, which is definitely a little bit more of a mouthful. I definitely like the shorter version. But essentially it's like where you have your generational family tree, and then you have the branches down to the roots, and how certain things happen and parts of the family tree tend to fall away and they're no longer part of the system of the tree and everyone else. So that's kind of how the title came about. And so of course, talking all that, I forgot about your second question, the second part of your question.
Getting to know your own family history, your own generations of history, and doing research for this novel.
Oh my gosh. The one thing about genealogy you're going to find out is that I was like, oh my gosh, my family is so quiet, nothing goes on. Yeah, the things that has happened in my family, one of the cool things that you find once you go back and actually do the research as far as you can, check newspapers. I'll give a very short story. My second great grandfather, I found out he was in a gunfight with another man. They were both miners in a small Iowa town, and there was a gunfight. His wife was out cheating on him. He goes and he finds his wife. He brings her back to the house. Then later he grabs his gun. He confronts the man who was philandering with his wife, and then they have a gunfight, and then he ends up shooting the guy dead. So it's amazing the stories, the people going back to even pre-slavery. I was lucky to break through the 1870 wall with a couple of my ancestors. Oh, that was a big blessing to find those. I still have family members, specifically on the Madison side. Madison is actually my maiden name. And so there were family stories about how my family came from the Madison plantation, and I still have not solved that mystery yet. So stay tuned. I'm still hunting for that one. But in terms of that translating to the fallen fruit, it was more of a what were their lives like? How were they able to survive? I mean, obviously I'm a descendant, but what was the resilient? How did they persevere in terms of the different circumstances that they had going on? So in terms of writing the fallen fruit, I really wanted to tap to what was it like for my ancestors in the 1960s around the civil rights era? What was it like for my ancestors around the 1920s, the 10s, the American Revolution? It was just a really deep dive into really thinking deeply about my ancestors' journey and bringing that to life through the characters. So it was so much fun to read about my family's, we'll call it the tea, the piping hot tea.
That's great. That's a good way to put it. If anybody wants to see the cover, if you didn't Google it already, there's a link there where for all of our panelists' books. Just a reminder, you can pick those up from bookshop.org on that link. Let's go back to Kaia. I'm curious, you talked a little bit about doing your research about Effa Manley and kind of getting the story from her. But then what was it like for you to take that information and take this real historical figure, make her into a fictional character, and what were the challenges of that? And I'm also curious to know if you were in touch with Effa's family.
I was not in touch with her family. From what I can tell, I think there's a niece who didn't really know her that's still around. Effa herself did not have any biological children. And even with my first book, I did not reach out to living family members because it's more so it gives me more room to play. And if they want to tell their stories, they should be able to tell their stories without me milking it, if you will. That's how I think about it. But how like I said, I struggled with trying to figure out what was she thinking, what was driving her. And then when I went back in real life, Mrs. Manley did a series of interviews before her passing in the 70s, and she talked about her life and things like that. And she had mentioned with her first marriage, she was married 4 times. My book covers the second marriage. She said with her first husband, that didn't work out because I had ambition. That was her quote. And what she didn't say it, but the unspoken part was, and he did not. And so once I got that, I was like, okay, I get it. I get her now. She was extremely ambitious, very single-minded about getting herself out there, or I think she wanted to be seen, because the fact that she kind of blended between these two worlds, these identities, it was just a matter of, I don't fit in anyone's box, so I'm going to just be me, be who I am, and say what I have to say, and I don't care that this is my place, that you need to go home and be in the kitchen. No, I'm a business executive. I'm negotiating these contracts. I'm setting up all these special events at the park. And when Major League Baseball came knocking, she was the first Negro League owner to be compensated for her players when they would sign them, to actually sit down and say, hey, let's do this trade, if you will. I'm not going to say she was perfect. Even in those interviews, she talked about how the players were their property. And I was like, oh, really? We have this woman talking about these Black baseball players as her property in the 1970s. And this was pre-free agency. So she definitely, I look up to her in that she was bold in a time when it doesn't matter what her racial identity. In the 30s and 40s, she was, if you know anything about these guys who run these businesses and these baseball teams, she stood toe to toe with them and told them about themselves when they needed to be told. She was just completely fascinating, and different iterations of her life. So to get that all down on paper, there's times where there's a certain section of the book where she's making bad decisions around the same time in real life, and I could not figure out why that happened. And once I started putting dates together, I'm like, oh, this is why she's making bad decisions. And even my editor was like, it doesn't sound like her. Why is she doing that? And I'm like, because this thing happened here. And it was like one of those things that no one picks up. The sports writers who have written up about her, it's usually, oh, she was doing it was always the yellow journalism type of thing where, oh, she was just flaunting her sexuality and she was, beautiful and all that. And, again, trying to put her in a place. But there's really real human reasons why she was doing and how she came, what she was doing, and the things that don't quite make sense. So that was fun. And I think there's only one time where I wrote a scene. I finished it, and then very clearly in her voice in my head, that never happened. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll just delete this and figure out another way to get from point A to point B.
So you were a little bit constricted, but it sounds like you stayed very true to history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, especially with the stories, I tell when they're not as well known, or they kind of buck against the grain of what we think of women in these historical times. I want to keep it as true or as plausible as possible. I may have to do what Shawntelle does and go dip into fantasy so I can have the more outlandish things I want to say or show. But yeah, I do try to keep it, because I've had people say that there's no way that ever happened. I'm like, okay, well, here's my source. You go deal
Yeah.
with that. You work that out for yourself.
Yeah.
Brynn, I wanted to ask you about how you started writing. You lived in Brazil, and it sounds like there are some challenges around just getting used to the new setting and the new culture, which sounded like it led you to do some writing. So can you talk about what that was like and how that helped you?
Sure. So I moved to Rio with zero Portuguese, and a lot of sweaters. So not at all equipped to succeed in Rio de Janeiro. Um, and I didn't know anyone but my husband. And so it was very isolating, because they do speak Portuguese. There's some English, but it is not like many cities in Europe that are very much English and German or English and Dutch. And you can always find that is not the case, or especially not the case back in 2006 when I moved there. And so it was very isolating. So I started blogging in 2006. We weren't doing YouTube streaming yet. It was blogs. And it was a way to connect with people back home and share my story with them, and they would comment, and it was just a way for me to write about what I was going through. And it was definitely those first couple years, it was, laugh so you're not crying. Even though I spent plenty of time crying in the bathroom. It was definitely use humor. You know, there was, I still remember one of my first pieces was just like being on the bus and just how fast these buses went. I was like, oh my God, this is how I die. And so just, I mean, and writing about those little moments and like trying to find the humor, but also like, what could I learn from that? What were the differences? And so then I started, and I was writing a lot. And that's where I found my voice and was writing the creative nonfiction. So the blog posts became more structured, pointed essays that I started submitting places, and that really turned into creative nonfiction essays. But then I found myself, as I was learning more about Brazil, there were more stories I wanted to tell than just my own. And at that point, I had built enough confidence to try fiction, to try writing in someone else's voice, to try writing imaginary characters. And I was maybe in Brazil 6 or 7 years before I tried fiction, but it was about 6 years of creative nonfiction writing as a means of coping and adapting and processing. That then led to the confidence to try fiction. I learned all about fiction writing like through the internet, like doing Writer's Digest online workshops, and like back in the day, Query Shark. And thank God for the internet, because that was the only way I learned about like the craft of fiction writing and the business of fiction writing and how you even go about getting a book published. I was all like self-taught through the internet and online workshops.
Well, that's very resourceful. Some of us had to pay a lot of money to go to school to learn all that.
I mean, my degree is in a social science, so I did write a lot. Like it was a writing-based degree, but it was very much citations and, you know, here's your methodology section. And so it wasn't exactly fun to read, but it was writing heavy. So
Yeah, my background's a little bit similar in that I started writing essays myself, and took me a long time to figure out the craft elements of fiction. But it's wonderful that you're able to do that and engage readers in a wonderful story. But I'd like to invite some questions from the audience. We do have kind of a small group. I'm hoping there wasn't a technical issue, but this is being recorded, so we'll put that up on YouTube. We do have a question from Karima, and she actually has a question for Brynn, and she asked you to discuss the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Pope actually gave Brazil to Portugal. Do you know much about that?
is that when they divided essentially the known world between Spain and Portugal? Yes. And so they're one of my three. Okay, I'll back up. So if you don't know what that is, the Pope at the time, the two biggest colonial players were Spain and Portugal, and then the Pope. And so Spain and Portugal were on all sorts of skirmishes and proxy wars and drawing lines and maps with lines in different places. We own this, no, we own this. And the Pope was like, I got it, guys. I'm going to divide the whole world that we know about between the two of you. And so the Pope divided essentially South America between Spain and Portugal. And it's why you have Brazil down to a bunch of Spanish speaking, I mean, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina. And so you can kind of see where the line was that the Pope drew through language use nowadays. And one of my characters, Isabel, she is Guarani Portuguese. Her mother's Guarani. And she interacts with a hotel owner, Tia Antonio, who is also Guarani. And Tia Antonia comes from a does anyone remember? I'm gonna forget with Jeremy Irons and I'm gonna blank on the Mission. The Mission. If anybody saw that movie back in the day, The Mission, it was a Spanish missionary that the Guarani people fled to because the Portuguese were like trying to enslave them. And the Spanish missionaries, they came in, they had to convert, but the Spanish missionaries actually created a written Guarani that they could learn in, and they learned the Bible in Guarani, and they like developed their own communities under the protection of the missionaries. But then the Pope draws a new line, and suddenly some of the Spanish missionaries end up on the Portuguese side, and the Portuguese come and like invade the Spanish missionaries. And so Tia Antonia's mother fled one of the Spanish. So Tia Antonio speaks Portuguese and Spanish and Guarani because she was in one of those. This is not in the story, by the way. This is just in my head. I know why this character speaks these three languages. So that's just an example of all the research that you do that doesn't actually end up in the book, like not explicitly, but I can justify why this character speaks these three languages, like through the history of the region.
And interestingly enough, my brother speaks Guarani because he was in the Peace Corps in Paraguay.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Tia Antonia speaks Guarani and she's trying to teach Isabel. So there's this like little friction because Isabel's like, whatever, I'm from Rio, I'm Brazil, I speak Portuguese, I don't want to know. And so there's some scenes where she's trying to encourage Isabel to speak more Guarani. But that's just one of those little snippets. So yes, and I don't ever mention that treaty specifically, but it did inform the backstory of one of my characters.
Let's then keep on the same topic of research rabbit holes. I'm not seeing any more questions from the audience. If you do have a question, please feel free to post that in the chat and I'll ask our panelists. But I'm sure all of you had to kind of stop yourself from going down the wrong path. Donna, did you experience that at all?
I did. So the first thing I did when I decided this was going to be the setting for my story, the historical setting, was expanded my book budget exponentially. But because I live here too, there are lots of local resources. So that was fine. And you know, I blocked off a set of, you know, I think I did 3 months where I did nothing but research and sort of figure out how the story was going to take shape before I started writing. And then someone said, if you're looking for specifics, have you checked out newspapers.com? And I was like, no. And I did. And it was such a rabbit hole because I could put in the place, the time period. So I did, you know, December 6th to December 29th, maybe, in Halifax. And you can put in search strings too. So I was in particular looking for things about orphans and babies at this particular time. And of course, it comes back with all these hits. And I'm like, this is amazing. And I had to stop myself because you learn so much more than just what you're looking for. You learn how they speak. What's important in society is so different from age to age. And advertisements, like things that it was just beyond. So I totally fell down that rabbit hole and I'd be like, just going through, and then I have to stop. I have to write the book at some point. But then if I was looking for it, so there's a scene in the book where Charlotte sees an ad in the paper and it's a big turning point in the plot. And that was actually an ad that was in one of the Halifax evening papers. And so I brought that into the story, and it was just non-specific enough that it completely worked for my plot. But what a rabbit hole to go down. And it was so fun, but I have to like not do that.
Shawntelle or Kaia, did either of you fall into that rabbit hole?
I live on newspapers.com as well. One unexpected rabbit hole outside of that that I, for my book is I wound up reading the history of Black Broadway, because when I was on newspapers.com, Effa Manley doesn't pop up into the newspaper record only for a very specific amount of time. But in the social columns are gold, and they would have like these events or fundraisers or things that she was a part of, and this one name always kept popping up, and I would basically just look up all these different women to find out, okay, who were they? And Avis Blake keeps coming up. She was the wife of UB Blank, who was one of the co-creators of Shuffle Along, the first successful Black musical on Broadway. And so I basically, in order to cobble together an understanding or the lives of the wives, you have to read about the husbands. So I basically had to read the history of Shuffle Along just to get an idea of what was going on, and you know what her personality was even like to make that happen. So yeah, luckily a book had just come out on it, so I was able to learn quite a lot and squeeze it all into that that one scene in the opener, or towards the open of the book.
Isn't that so true though, when we're
Mhm.
writing female characters, that everything seems to be filtered through the male gaze and we have to go searching for it? And I mean, that's a big reason why I write female-centric books.
Yeah, me too. But
Yeah.
you can't, it's always like the little throwaways, like even how I jumped on to Avis Blake was a throwaway article mention that Effa had thrown a birthday party at her house, and it was the first name. And I was like, okay, let's just go with this name. And you're like, oh wow, she was interacting with this person, which explains in her scrapbook why she has all these sheet music autographed by composers and things. And you're like,
Oh,
oh, okay, that
cool.
makes sense. Yeah.
Shawntelle, I wanted to ask you about, I don't know if it's your day job or you write code, which sounds like using a very different part of your brain than doing creative writing. Can you talk about, does that help you? Does it make it more challenging? What's that like?
The thing about, and actually it translates well into the research thing, because I had to research like almost more than 6 time periods and condense that information down. And so I kind of use the same thing where, so I'm a web developer. That's kind of like I was a web developer before I became an author. And so I'm very methodical. I have to pay attention to detail. And I tend to, most of the time when you're a developer, you're constantly learning new things. I call it sucking from the fire hydrant and hoping it doesn't blow you away, that kind of thing. So, the one thing that I would say was problematic about being a coder is that for me personally, it's tapping into the same well of creativity. So if I have a problem I have to solve in terms of code, I'm using the same part of my brain that I would if I'm encountering a writing problem where I have a plot hole or I have something else where I have to weave my way out of it. So if I code all day, I'm usually tapped out to where I envy the folks who say, oh, well, I worked all day and then I'm going to write tonight. Well, for me, when I'm coding all day, that evening it's over. There is nothing left in the well. I need to give it time to refill. And so for me, in terms of coding and writing, there has to be a balance. So, and since I'm an independent contractor, there's times when I'm on the bench, times when I'm off the bench. So I use those times to really write versus other times like, okay, I call them the ladies in the basement who come up with ideas. We let them play Parcheesi when I'm coding, and that's how that ends up working out. So yeah.
You have fun little names for everything. We do have a question from Greg, and it deals with craft. It's about writing dialogue. How do you make sure the characters express themselves rather than sounding like historical textbooks? So obviously, in dialogue, we're conveying information to the reader, but how do you make that sound natural? Does anyone in particular want to jump on this one? Go ahead, Kaia.
I had a great tip from author Beverly Jenkins a few years ago. She
Yes.
spends a lot of time reading letters from the time period. Usually in your local libraries or archives, people will donate their letters and you can see how they talk to each other. Obviously, it's not exactly the same as dialogue, but it gives you a sense of language and things to use. Because I'm writing in early 20th century, luckily we have recordings, audio recordings. Like I said, Effa Manley had this, I think it was about 6 hours worth of interview material that was recorded audio. So I was able to listen to it. And even though it was 30, 40 years after the fact, it gave you a sense of just personality, words that she would use. And then look, if you do some digging on the internet, I was able to find some 1920s, 1930s slang that I was able to work in.
I was going to add to that a good resource that I found is the Founding Fathers archive that you can just search online for that and you can see so many letters from the American Revolution into the early 1800s. And like she said, it gives you an idea of how people spoke, what words they use. So definitely there's so many resources out there.
I actually used a book of slang as well. There's a local author who writes little, like, funny little bathroom readers, but there is a Nova Scotia book of slang. And I loved going through and just picking through, because some of the slang that I use now, of course, didn't exist 100 years ago. But some of it, some of it was just learning where some of our expressions come from. So I did find that occasionally if I slipped one in, you have to use a really light hand. But occasionally if you do slip one in, it does make it sound a little more regional, a little more authentic.
I recently edited a book set in the American Revolution, and the curse words are hilarious. And I'm very curious to know where the author found them all, but maybe there's a book of 18th century curses somewhere. Well, we're up against the hour here, so we're going to wrap things up. I want to thank our panelists once again. I want to thank everyone who attended the panel. We didn't have a lot of live participants today, but this is recorded, and I'll send that recording out to everybody who registered and put it up on YouTube and our website. Just a reminder that we'd love it if you're able to support these authors by buying their books, but even if you can't afford to buy their books right now, or maybe there's just no more room on your shelf, definitely go to the library to pick them up, or just post it on social media and let others know about these wonderful histories. I'm just so impressed by all of you and the work that you went through to put these stories out in the world and to let people know about these important people in history. So thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to my last question. I always end the panel by asking, why historical fiction? Because obviously all of you have done a ton of research. You could have written a historical textbook or nonfiction, but you decided to share these histories through fiction. So why? What's the value in doing that? Donna, why don't you start us off?
That's a really good question. And I actually stopped for a minute and wondered, why do I do that? But I think it's because growing up when I was learning history in history class, I found it so boring. And it was because it was so many facts. And honestly, it's a lot of telling without showing. So when I could ingest my history through story and through real people and their emotions and what happens to them, then it resonates with me. And then it puts me there, and it's just so much more intimate, I think. So that's why I've been a reader of Histovic for such a long time, and then happy to be making that transition over as a writer and just having such a good time doing it.
And how about you, Shawntelle? What's the value of sharing these stories through fiction?
I'm similar to Donna, where I transitioned from another genre space. And for me, it was an opportunity to go beyond the studying that I was doing with the genealogy and ask myself the questions, what was it like for my family to live during these time periods? I really love to tap into relationships. And what better way to go deeper into what their history was like in the past, but explore those relationships during that time period. Of course, adding in the twist of time travel is all something else. There was so much more other things to explore, other events. So for me, it was a way to go deeper and ask the what if questions for what it was like for my ancestors back then.
Yeah, what if is always a good question to explore. Kaia, how about you? Why share Effa's story through historical fiction?
Well, one, there's about 3 or 4 books that already exist, nonfiction about her, but it was more the baseball Effa versus the woman herself. And so I had to cobble together what her life would have looked like because there's only bits and pieces. And I guess ethically, or the correct way to do history or historical writing, you need to be able to back everything up. And I kind of had to figure it out and do a more sociological, my background's sociology, way of telling her story.
It looks like we're seeing John Flynn's screen, so that's all right. We'll just continue on. Brynn, you're up last here. Take it home for us.
All right. Well, I think as Donna, Shawntelle, Kaia have said, historical fiction humanizes history. And the same thing, you learn it in class, and it's dates and things to memorize and definitions of terms and dates of treaties. But these treaties are written by people who are as messy and dramatic and maybe dumb or brilliant as we are. And you can't understand a thing without knowing what made it and what went into making it. And current society was made by everything that happened before. So it's critical to understand history, but we so often present it in the most boring way possible that nobody wants to learn it. So in order to understand how we got here, I think historical fiction is a great way to humanize, make it interesting, make history accessible and relevant by focusing on those relationships and those emotions that were happening during those critical time periods and during those moments. And that's why historical fiction.
Yeah, well said. It's easy to forget how relevant that history actually is when we're just kind of looking at it as text on a page. But when you humanize it, realize that not much has changed. We're all the same, just trying to make it day by day. Well, thanks again, panelists. Thanks again to everyone who attended, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.